Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. Seems like a perfect way to spend a rainy afternoon where we are experiencing heavy rainfall. My name is Sean Kramer. If we haven't met before, I'm the Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellow at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. Of course, I want to give the floor to our four fantastic guests, but first I thought I'd open with some remarks about how this colloquium idea came into being, which is unfolding in conjunction with the exhibition Irreplaceable You, Personhood and Dignity in Art, 1980s to now. So from an early point in the conception of the exhibition, I knew I wanted to complement the show with a gathering of scholars who could help us think deeper about how artists respond to overwhelming or distressing circumstances, such as systemic or acute violence, catastrophe, or collective trauma. The exhibition project itself was driven more out of an impulse to ask questions and seek resonances rather than to map out an art historical trend or to define a new field. Over the past decade or more, numerous scholars and commentators have noted the increasing role of the media and social media in shaping our realities, often molding them into algorithmically defined echo chambers. While audiences have been able to consume imagery of horrors, tragedies, and violence since the advent of the illustrated press in the 19th century, the technologies of the 24-hour news cycle, internet, and smartphone have increased these tendencies exponentially. This has led theorists and scholars alike into decades-long debates on whether the consumption of such imagery and accounts desensitizes us, erodes empathy, and even prompts a fetishistic obsession with violence, especially racial violence. Today's two sessions and conversations bring us into a discussion about how one approaches these issues in creative practice, in curatorial practice, in research, and in the classroom. When I reached out to these four to participate, I encouraged them to think of personhood and dignity as broadly or as narrowly as they saw fit. They were invited to ruminate on intricate processes of dehumanization and rehumanization, the entanglements among art, protest, and advocacy, the elusive question of whether art is able to build a capacity for empathy, and the tightrope of visibility and safety. However, I didn't just assign them topics at random. These were all ideas and concerns I already knew they were thinking seriously about. I was, of course, familiar with their work, but what was exciting to see when they sent me their talk titles and descriptions was not just how well they understood the assignment, but also how well they fit together. In fact, these sessions really kind of came together very naturally and logically. So the first session that we'll hear about, called Possibilities and Limits, explores the uses of not just such media as film and photography to encapsulate our complex present, but also the limits of discourse, what stories, whose suffering are discursively framed as worthy to be uttered and whose are discounted, if not purposefully removed from public discourse. As the two talks progress, we might ponder, for instance, the different political and effective implications of uttering the words Rwanda and Palestine. This may impel us to wonder, how do we approach these issues in the institutions of art, the academy, and the museum? The second session, Relations, makes us consider how friendship and love, mourning and refusal can function as powerful forms of resistance. Artists are part of communities just as much as they may document or help us understand communities. Another thread that ties these four talks together is a focus on photography and film, which makes a substantial portion of the exhibition as well. And so maybe an idea for all of us to consider as these talks unfold, and maybe as we come back to the conversation later this afternoon, is what is the role and what are the limits of these mediums in making claims about the humanity of individuals and communities? What, if anything, do they accomplish in addition to or distinction from other forms of creative production, for example, drawing, painting, or sculpture? What arises to the surface for me also about these 4 talks and these 4 invited guests is that using different strategies and in different professional contexts, they demonstrate that their intellectual and creative output around these issues is driven by a deep care for people and for communities. So today's colloquium will comprise 3 parts. There will be 2 sessions with 2 speakers each. Both sessions will include an opportunity for questions from the audience. The colloquium will conclude with some closing remarks from BCMA co-director Ann Collins-Goodyear, which will serve as a prompt for a short conversation among the 4 speakers and moderators. While this will be an opportunity for our speakers to ask each other questions and offer thoughts, audience members are also invited to join the conversation. We'll have a coffee break between the 2 sessions and another short break between sessions 2 and the conversation. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Sascha Crasnow is an assistant professor of art history at Drake University, specializing in contemporary art from the Swana region, especially Palestine. She writes on global contemporary art practices with a particular focus on Swana, Southwest Asia, and North Africa, race, sociopolitics, gender, and sexuality. Her writing has appeared in publications such as Art Journal, the Journal of Visual Culture, and Lateral, as well as a number of edited volumes. She is also a co-editor of the forthcoming publication Queer Contemporary Art.
It's out.
Sorry?
It's out. It came out in October.
Oh.
I need to update that.
Of the recently released publication. Queer Contemporary Art, go get one. With Anne-Marie Butler from Intellect Press out in October 2024?
Yeah.
There you go. Okay, update this. So the title of her talk is Documentary Limitations on the Possibility of the Fantastical in the Works of Larissa Sansour. Please join me in welcoming Sascha Crasnow.
Thank you, Sean, for that introduction and for inviting me to participate in this series of talks and this conversation today. Thank you also to everyone at, who knows, you'll be able to see it, it's fine. Thanks to everyone at the Bowdoin Museum for welcoming us, to my fellow panelists who I've already really enjoyed getting to talk to, and I look forward to more, and to everyone who came out to hunker down from the rain here. With kind of the deluge outside, I thought I would also start us off with a little clip from one of the 2 films that I'm going to be talking about by Larissa Sansour today that features a deluge of a different sort to kind of set the mood for a bit. So we've tested it, and the audio should work as long as I can get it to play from the beginning. Let's see how well my ability to work technology is. Great so far. The glitches are the added suspense. In the opening minute of Larissa Sansour's 2-channel film, In Vitro, an oil-like black substance pours down the narrow historic roads of Bethlehem, sloshing into the Church of the Nativity, and ultimately setting the city aflame. The eerie music that accompanies the black and white visuals gives the overall impression of doom and dystopia. While the film was made in 2016 and the cause of the destruction witnessed in the rooftop view of the city is the environmental disaster that has befallen it, in 2025, it is difficult not to view the eruptions of flames in a Palestinian city in the context of the persistent bombing in the current genocide in Gaza. As with all of Sansour's science fiction films, for which she is most well known today, her inventions of the future are intimately tied with the present, both in Palestine and across the globe. When Sansour began making art in the early 2000s, she created works that relied on documentary recordings. Video, audio, or both, taken within Palestine and documenting the daily lived realities under occupation, restrictions on movement, violence from the army and settlers, and bureaucratic rigmarole, served as the foundation for these works. A Palestinian living in the United Kingdom, Sansour found, however, that responses to her videos demonstrated that viewers did not believe the depictions of Palestinian experiences that appeared in her videos. Viewers felt that her position as a Palestinian meant that she was exaggerating Palestinian realities, a common refrain particularly from pro-Israel representatives that call for a quote-unquote balance to any Palestinian voice with a pro-Israel one. For many international viewers, the absurdist realities of navigating daily life under which Palestinians live seem surreal and thereby impossible to believe. In addition to this, Sansour began to feel limited by the constraints of the documentary form to articulate something beyond the visual narratives told through news stories, which have oversaturated many mass media portrayals of the region to the point of compassion fatigue among non-Palestinian viewership. In the face of this, Sansour turned to science fiction as a means by which to draw out the dystopian realities of a Palestinian present and possibilities of Palestinian futures. Science fiction has a long history of imagining futures as a means to talk about the past and present. Now we get body snatchers. In the United States, for example, media depicting alien invasions and mind control echoed the Cold War anxieties of communist infiltration and xenophobic threats to American white supremacy. To bring in just two examples, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, originally a 1955 book, adapted into a film in 1956, and subsequently in 78, 93, and 2007, among other related variations. People really like this movie, apparently. Appealed to the anxieties of individuals on both the left and the right in the Cold War United States. The right saw it as a reference to communist mind control and the threat of infiltration, while the left read the analogy as one of McCarthyite conformity imposed upon the masses. Science fiction has, of course, not just been used to comment on the Cold War, but also look at other global engagements. I would be remiss not to mention our organizer's favorite science fiction preoccupation, including my favorite gif ever of these horrible shields that I can never get enough of. Dune, again, also originally a book with multiple film and television adaptations. The story of a white savior messiah that examines questions of colonization, exploitation of resources, and the treatment of indigenous populations and lands. Sansour herself has found that science fiction offers a unique opportunity to engage with concerns of the present without some of the roadblocks she encountered with her documentary works. As she noted in an interview with visual culture scholar Anthony Downey, quote, "For me, the allure of sci-fi is to be able to talk about the present without being dictated by the current political jargon. By getting rid of the present-day context, the past and its consequences can be reframed. This is particularly helpful when dealing with the Palestinian question, I think. It gives me the chance to single out neglected or overlooked details, enlarge them, and emphasize their importance," end quote. In the context of science fiction, debates over exaggeration of realities are pushed aside, and rather, viewers may be enticed to seek out the real-life experiences from which Sansour's imagined futures stem. Through the contextualization of Palestinian lived experiences into science fiction imaginings, Sansour also creates space for generalizability as well, forging opportunities for solidarity and connection. In my paper today, I'll briefly discuss two of Sansour's science fiction works, 2012's Nation Estate and 2019's In Vitro, examining how the use of science fiction articulates both the specifics of the Palestinian contemporary experience and, through a generalizability, lays the groundwork for potential solidarity in hopes of a better future. Nation Estate is a 9-minute speculative answer of sorts to the quote-unquote Palestinian question. With the ever-expanding Israeli settlements and restrictions on new constructions for Palestinians, Sansour imagines a solution to the impossibility of horizontal expansion: verticality. The video follows a woman, played by Sansour, as she makes her way from the Amman Express, presumably a much speedier route from Jordan to Palestine than the existing Allenby Bridge, into the Nation Estate and up to her apartment. While the full scope of the high-rise building is only revealed in full at the end, viewers are given indications as to the structure that the protagonist moves through as she waits for the elevator. An enormous list of floors and their corresponding purposes functions like the directory for a monumental office building, with business names replaced by those of Palestinian cities and bureaucratic infrastructure. Each city's floor contains a replica of the cultural sites for which it is known, and these are indeed replicas rather than transplanted landmarks, a fact that is evidenced in the final moments of the video as Sansour gazes out her window, seeing the real Dome of the Rock replicated on the Jerusalem floor glimmering in the distance. In addition to the icons of the cities themselves, there are many references to distinctly Palestinian symbols throughout the video. The colors of the Palestinian flag, red, green, white, and black, appear not just in the flag hanging in the lobby, but on Sansour's key card, food containers, and the biometrics that grant her permission into the building. The cactus and olive tree, both of which as indigenous plants to Palestine serve as symbolic references to the land in Palestinian art history and visual culture, make an appearance. And it's sort of hard to see, but the cactuses are at the top of those kind of large pillars in the lobby. The pattern of the keffiyeh, the black and white patterned scarf that was made notable as a nationalist symbol through its ubiquitous wear by former Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, leader and first president of the Palestinian Authority, Yasser Arafat, appears on the crockery in Sansour's kitchen, in which she places traditional Palestinian meals. I'll also say there are way more than even just those, but I could talk for an hour just about this video, so I'm limiting myself to these. While Sansour herself discusses the use of these symbols as a gesture highlighting the way that they have become ubiquitous yet empty symbols of the nationalist cause, she also, whether intentionally or not, indicates the potential for them to be imbued with new meaning, something she later explicitly aims to do in her 2016 video, In the Future They Ate from the Finest Porcelain. In the lobby of the Nation Estate hangs a poster advertising the skyscraper. It is modeled on the 1936 Visit Palestine poster, seen here on the lower right, and which many people probably recognize. The poster was originally created, as I said, in 1936 by Franz Krauss. While the poster has become associated with Palestinian liberation, resistance, and solidarity due to its declaration of the existence of Palestine, alongside an image of Jerusalem, recognizable because of the Dome of the Rock, thereby also signaling Jerusalem as part of Palestine, the poster was originally created by Krauss to encourage Jewish immigration to Palestine. The use of the word Palestine was simply because that is what the land was called. In 1936, there was no Israel, only the British Mandate in Palestine. The reference to this poster in Sansour's video adds a distinct aura of the possibility to other symbols in the video, and in contemporary Palestinian nationalism, that they too may be imbued with a new, powerful meaning. Sansour's Nation Estate is shaped by tension between utopian possibilities and the extension of harsh Palestinian realities to dystopian ends. Sansour herself has said that she does not consider Nation Estate to be either dystopian or utopian. While it certainly allows for a greater access between Palestinian cities that would be impossible currently, For example, a Palestinian living in Bethlehem would only be able to visit Jerusalem with a permit granted by the Israeli government, something infrequently done, as opposed to the press of an elevator button. The cities that Palestinians are accessing are simulacra of the real thing. Additionally, as the small print in an elevator ad indicates, the mobility that you are granted in the nation state is still subject to potential restrictions. The policing of those who enter the building indicated by the biometric scans Sansour undergoes upon arrival. While rooted in the particular experiences of Palestinians, especially restrictions on mobility and access to the breadth of historic Palestine, nation state is couched in the aesthetics of a techno-capitalist future that carries concerns and thereby potential for solidarity globally. The stark white that predominates in the building gives it a pristine yet sterile feel that one associates more with an office building than a home. This is emphasized by the lighting that appears on the ceilings of the various floors, tube lighting that emphasizes the artificiality of the space and elicits impressions of corporate standardization rather than comfort and home. The aesthetics of the nation state bring to mind the destruction of unique and historic homes, businesses, and communities to make way for the gentrifying presence of luxury apartment buildings that all look roughly the same, a feature of a growing number of cities globally. The slick mirrored exterior, and I have to thank Sean for this connection here, the slick mirrored exterior of the building and the pillar/phallic-like height of the skyscraper also resemble other monumental buildings, specifically the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, completed in 2009, and One World Trade Center in New York City, the structure of which was completed in 2012, the same year Nation State was released. Each of these stands as a display of wealth and capitalism. The Burj Khalifa serves as an example of the Gulf futurist aesthetic that has come to be emblematic of wealth and luxury in the region, centered around hyper-modern aesthetics and pushing the limits of what structural engineering can do. In the case of One World Trade Center, the added context of its construction at the site of the former World Trade Center, destroyed during the September 11, 2001 attacks, serves as a symbol of luxury and capitalism as representative of freedom. This is underscored by its position steps away from the Oculus Mall, also at the center's site. This notion of capitalism as freedom sits in stark contrast to Sansour's nation state, which is surrounded by a now fully enclosing separation or apartheid wall complete with watchtowers. The biometric scan that Sansour is subjected to upon entering the building now in 2025 do not even appear futuristic, but rather mirror the experiences of a growing number of airports and border control, perhaps drudging up existing and exponentially growing, since the work was made, concerns surrounding data collection, surveillance, and privacy. The very title of the work belies the two sides to this futuristic vision, especially when considered in the context in which Sansour lives, England. The word estate conjures both extreme luxury, like the manors that populate Austen novels, as well as serves to refer to what we call in the States public or project housing, which in the UK are often high-rise structures. The question of what technology and so-called progress brings, utopia or dystopia, and for whom, serves as a more generalized provocation Sansour poses to her viewers in Nation Estate. Sansour's extension of Palestinian realities to universal concerns through science fiction future imaginings is visible again in her 2019 collaboration with her partner Soren Lind for the Venice Biennale's Danish pavilion, In Vitro, which we saw a clip of at the beginning. The two-channel black and white film imagines Bethlehem after an ecological disaster that has sent the surviving population underground. The film centers on two individuals. One is an older woman played by Hiam Abbas, who lies on her deathbed, optimistic about the imminent return of humanity to the surface and their replanting of the heirloom seeds that they have been cultivating in an underground orchard. The other is a younger woman played by Maisa Abdelhadi, who it is revealed is a clone of the older woman's daughter. Her daughter, who we see as a child in flashbacks, presumably perished either during or in the aftermath of the ecological disaster. Unlike Nation Estate, there are only a few overt references that root this in a distinctly Palestinian context. The exterior shots reveal landmarks that can be recognized as Bethlehem, such as the Church of the Nativity, which we also saw replicated on the Bethlehem floor of Nation Estate. Dialogue, which is absent in Nation Estate, is entirely in Arabic and in vitro. And the ecological disaster itself has ties, if not to Palestine specifically, to West Asia as a whole, appearing like a rushing flood of oil. However, the overarching narrative of a struggle to survive, a desire for thriving agriculture in the face of ecological disaster, and a lack of resources ties in with not Palestinian futures, but contemporary realities. Water resources are already a major concern in Palestine, with the Israeli military taking control of all water resources and infrastructure in the Palestinian territories after occupying them in 1967. A military order prevents Palestinian construction of any new infrastructure related to water without a permit, something that is almost never granted. According to Amnesty International, even rainwater harvesting cisterns are often destroyed by the Israeli army. This lack of water resources is not just a threat to survival, but also an impediment to farming and agriculture, a long-standing focal industry for Palestinians. Today, many farmers are subject to violent attacks on their land, including the destruction of harvesting fields by Israeli settlers in the West Bank, and of course, bombing campaigns in Gaza. The underground orchard, which you can see here, that is the central focus of the above-ground reintegration for the characters in vitro, echoes the desire for a return to Palestine and commitment to working the land, emphasized by the opening conversation between the two characters, discussing the current state of habitability of the surface. However, despite these connections to the Palestinian context, Sansour also makes clear the generalizability of the concerns discussed in vitro. Dunya, Abbas's character, notes, quote, "Others were beginning to see what we had been experiencing for years," end quote. Sansour herself has noted that many of the environmental effects of climate change and future concerns about resources such as water that are topics of conversation globally are realities that residents of West Asia are already facing. Dunya continues, a word of warning to those globally watching in vitro that, quote, "It was clear that no place would be spared." Dunya's words speak beyond a Palestinian audience to drive home the fact that this ecological dystopia may be taking place in Bethlehem, but the concerns that Sansour is bringing up are ones that extend and should concern those across the globe. In vitro also engages with questions of memory and generational trauma. Alia, the clone, speaks about the memories that she has and her awareness that they are not her own. She states that she was raised on nostalgia. Nostalgia for a place she did not know, the surface to which she awaits return. However, she does not feel connected to this nostalgia. As a clone, these memories are not her own, but are implanted in her. As she remarks, quote, "The loss I feel was never mine," end quote. There are aspects of this that tie in directly to Sansour's experience as a Palestinian living in diaspora and of the generation born after 1967. Sansour was born in 1973. For the generation born prior to the Six-Day War, which happened in June 1967, what predominates is a nostalgia for a pre-Nakba, a pre-1948, with the foundation of the State of Israel and the exile of 750,000 Palestinians. So a pre-Nakba Palestine. For those born after 67 and the annexation of East Jerusalem and occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, among other territories, the idea of the Palestine for which the older generation feels nostalgia feels too far away. Rather than looking to the past, many Palestinians of this younger generation are more interested in looking to the future as a way to envision something different for Palestinian liberation than a return to a past from which they feel disconnected. While Sansour envisions this from the perspective of her own experience, feelings of disconnection to ideas of homeland or a nostalgia for a past may be relatable to others living in exile or diaspora across ethnic backgrounds. The conversation continues with Dunya telling Alia that she has only ever known absence. Alia, seeming bitter about the constant reminder, laments what she describes as her, quote, "congenital exile." While Sansour was born in Palestine, she was born into internal displacement and later left to study in Europe, ultimately settling there. For many Palestinians, those born within historic Palestine but outside their ancestral homes, as well as those living in diaspora abroad, they are born into a state of exile, perhaps never having set foot in the place from which they have been exiled. Again, while Sansour speaks from her own personal experience and relationship to exile as a Palestinian, for anyone born in diaspora or into a state of exile, these feelings of displacement and a disconnect to home, memories of which may not be your own, may resonate. While Sansour came to science fiction as a means to move the conversation about Palestine outside of the stifled, controlled, and scrutinized parameters of documentary and reportage, her science fiction works have not allowed her to avoid political pushback entirely. While others may have found science fiction as a means by which to discuss taboo or politically contentious topics in a way that is veiled by their science fiction context, Sansour's position as a Palestinian and the predominance of what is known as the quote-unquote Palestinian exception, the limits on empathy and free speech when it comes to Palestine, have meant that there has been resistance against her science fiction works as well. In 2011, Sansour was a finalist for a photography prize administered by the Musée de Lycée in Lausanne, Switzerland, and sponsored by Lacoste. Sansour's storyboards that she presented as a finalist were related to her Nation Estate project. However, after sharing these with the museum and sponsor, Sansour was removed from the shortlist for the prize, due, according to Sansour, because she was told her work was, quote-unquote, too pro-Palestinian. The museum and brand both originally stated that Nation Estate did not align with the theme for the year's award, Joie de Vivre. However, the museum later distanced themselves from Lacoste, noting that the interpretation of the theme is always left to the artist, which could include, quote, authenticity or irony, end quote. Ultimately, Lacoste withdrew their funding for the award, which was canceled. It was this incident that for many, including myself, first introduced Larissa Sansour and her work. This is also not the only incident of this sort. In 2017, the Barbican was accused of including pro-Palestinian propaganda in an exhibition of science fiction work that included Sansour's 2016 film, In the Future They Ate from the Finest Porcelain. As Gillian Marin, chief executive of the main British Jewish organization in the UK, stated, quote, "This is blatant propaganda hiding behind the facade of a science fiction exhibition," end quote. The Barbican, to their credit, refused to remove the work, stating it was art, not propaganda. The exhibition contained a vast array of science fiction works, including Afrofuturist, feminist, and techno-dystopian media of a variety of forms, including film, television, and literature. Despite the fact that there were political under or overtones in many, if not all, the works in the exhibition, it is only Sansour's that was singled out as a work with a political agenda. It seems that even in the realm of science fiction, Palestine becomes an exception. Thank you. Are we doing questions now? Or? Oh, okay. Yes,
Thank you. Yes. I will see if I can figure out technology now. Well, because I cannot multitask, I was going to say thank you so much, Dr. Crasnow, for that presentation, but I was also trying to figure out technology at the same time. So I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Laura De Becker, who's the Chief Curator and Helmut and Candace Stern Curator of African Art at the University of Michigan Museum of Art. She's previously worked at the National Museum of Rwanda in Butare and the Wits Art Museum in Johannesburg, South Africa. Exhibitions at the University of Michigan Museum of Art include We Write to You About Africa, a reinstallation of the permanent African collection, Wish You Were Here, which grappled with issues of restitution, and Beyond Borders, Global Africa, among others. The title of her talk is Irreplaceable You, Absence and the Limits of Representation. Please join me in welcoming Laura De Becker.
Thank you, everyone. I don't need to do anything with this? Wow, that's amazing. Okay, great. Good afternoon. It is a real pleasure to be here in Maine. It's my first time to Maine. I've added a day at the front end to enjoy Portland. It's been amazing. So thank you for being so welcoming and for hosting us. And it is more than anything a real pleasure to see Sean again and to see what he's been working on since we had the great misfortune of departing from him at the University of Michigan. Yeah, I'm just so excited that I got to see the show, Sean. It's a beautiful show, and it's really nice to be here and reflect with all of you on some of the topics that the show discusses. So on the occasion of this colloquium, I have taken the opportunity to return to my academic roots. As many of you know, when you get to the role of chief curator, your life consists of budgets and meetings, and you don't get to do research as often as you would like. So I returned to some of the work that I did over a decade ago on the commemoration of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, my doctoral research. At the time, I was preoccupied with questions of memory, of mourning, and the politics of representation. But what I didn't fully realize until much later was how deeply these questions would follow me and would continue to echo through my work as a curator of African art first, and then even as a chief curator at the University of Michigan Museum of Art. So this presentation reflects on how that early scholarship has informed my ongoing thinking about curatorial responsibility, institutional critique, and artist engagement with trauma. My point of departure is Alfredo Jar's 1994-1995 series, Real Pictures, which we saw just an hour ago. A body of work that exemplifies the aesthetic and ethical tensions at the heart of representation. Through this work and others, I hope to explore how the refusal to represent, to show, or to visualize can itself be a powerful gesture of commemoration and critique. So for those of you who were not with us in the gallery, here's a reminder of what the work looks like. So in the second gallery of Irreplaceable You, we encounter a vitrine enclosing a black box. This box, very austere and visually inert, is inscribed with the following text: Katale refugee camp, 50 kilometers north of Goma, Zaire, Wednesday, August 31st, 1994. It goes on to describe, in words only, a vast sprawl of makeshift tents, 500,000 displaced Rwandan refugees, a solitary tree amid endless suffering. But the photograph, it is hidden, locked within the black box, sealed from public view. And of course, this gesture of refusal isn't incidental, but it's foundational to the work. As Sean mentioned during his wonderful tour, Alfredo Jar took more than 3,000 photographs during his time in Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo in August 1994, which was very shortly after the genocidal violence had ended. Upon his return from Rwanda and Congo, he describes experiencing and this is a quote from him, a crisis regarding the use of images, end quote. He understood that photography as a medium, as a mode of evidence, and as a presumed catalyst for immoral action had failed Rwanda. The genocide had unfolded in full view of the international community, and the world failed to intervene. This crisis was not without precedent. Photography's role in witnessing atrocity is well documented, and it's very interesting that this talk comes right after the previous one. As Barbie Zelitzer has written about the Holocaust liberation, so-called liberation photographs that were taken in the concentration camps, they were created in an attempt to report the essentially unbelievable. These images and the journalists who captured them grappled with the insufficiency of both narrative and visual representation. And in the end, at the time of the Holocaust and the reporting through these liberation photographs, the visual won at the time. It was, they were considered to be crucial ways of convincing audiences that this had actually taken place and was taking place. But by contrast, the visual record of the Rwandan genocide did not generate global urgency. We know, very famously, Susan Sontag has written about this, and I believe, Sascha, you just called it something moral fatigue. Yeah, compassion fatigue, which I really like as a term. But so at the time when the first photographs of the Nazi camps came out, there was nothing banal about these images. This is a quote from Sontag. There was nothing banal about these images. After 30 years, a saturation point was reached. And in these last decades, concerned photography has done at least as much to deaden conscience as to arouse it, end quote. So it is within this context that Jar made the conscious decision to withhold the image, to present instead the absence of the image, have it be described, archived, and encased, but inaccessible. If the photographic image once served to affirm the truth of atrocity, its proliferation now risks dulling the ethical response it once provoked. Real Pictures is just one of over 20 artistic projects that Jar created, reflecting on his encounters and experiences in Rwanda and the DRC. As Jar has remarked himself, each project was a new exercise, a new strategy, and a new failure. Basically, the serial structure of exercises was forced by the Rwandan tragedy and my incapacity to represent in a way that made sense, end quote. One of his earliest responses, in fact, was an installation in Sweden. So this predates the Real Pictures installation. In Malmö, he had been invited to participate in a public art project where he was given the use of 50 light boxes and wherein he could display any image he desired. However, he found himself turning away from the image in disgust and resorted to displaying the word Rwanda, Rwanda, Rwanda over and over again, previewing the same preference of text over images that he uses in Real Pictures. In another work that he created, reflecting on his experience in Rwanda, titled Untitled Newsweek, he confronts the lack of representation that the Rwandan genocide was given in American media. 17 covers of Newsweek are shown, with the first one coinciding with the start of the Rwandan genocide. Each cover is accompanied by details about concurrent massacres in Rwanda and the rising body counts. So by the 21st of April, when the United Nations decided to reduce its on-site presence and when an estimated 100,000 people had already been massacred, the Newsweek cover reads, "Better than vitamins, the truth about antioxidants." Others throughout this 100-day period detail Kurt Cobain's suicide, men, women, and computers, the death of Jackie Kennedy, the election of Mandela, and the O.J. Simpson trial. The last image shown is the first Newsweek cover dedicated to Rwanda, which was titled Hell on Earth, Racing Against Death in Rwanda. And Sean mentioned in the gallery tour that there's a whole nuanced, complex story behind the photographs that Jar took in these refugee camps, which were in fact run by Hutu militia at the time and included both Tutsi who had fled the violence and moderate Hutu who had fled the violence and Hutu genocidaires who had followed them. So it was like, there's no simple black or white narrative here. But the first Newsweek cover that was dedicated to the violence was indeed one of those refugee camps as well. So here we trace the timeline of the genocide through a lack of images dedicated to it or given a platform of such a scale. Real Pictures, again, this is an installation view. It's the first installation where Jar actually mines his own photographs, though of course they remain hidden from view. Within a darkened exhibition space, which mirrors the world's blindness to the events, all the images have been entombed in 100 black boxes that have been piled on top of each other, strongly suggesting the logic of an archive, a monument, or a cemetery. The images are invisible, and their stories have been described in text printed upon them. Jar explains the reasoning behind his non-representation as follows. If the media and their images fill us with an illusion of presence, which later leaves us with a sense of absence, why not try the opposite? That is, offer an absence that could perhaps provoke a presence. People were already shown a great quantity of images, but they did not see anything. No one saw anything because no one did anything. So I thought this time I won't show the images so that people can see them better, end quote. This artistic act aligns with what scholars such as Hartman and Kant have termed critical fabulation, or the refusal of the visual. These are interventions into dominant visual regimes that disrupt normative expectations around evidence, witnessing, and legibility. In Jar's hands, refusal becomes a strategy of resistance against commodification, against voyeurism, and against apathy. And then another important point here, and this I recognize in the previous talk too, is that for Jar, the Rwanda project is also very much about time and about slow time. The genocide took 100 days, which is very hard to wrap your head around, 1 million people in 100 days. While the violence was extremely rapid, Jar's response is actually very slow. It's years long, it's multiple projects, it's meditative. And there is real grief in that slowness and a kind of protest in not moving on and refusing to engage in this rapid fire consumption of images that we are too often exposed to. So similar questions to take this work that I did 10 years ago and try to bring it back to how has this influenced my curatorial practice and thinking. So these same questions about what is seen and unseen and who is remembered or omitted clearly resonate deeply within museum practice. We are, by our very nature, institutions of display. And absence is also in our foundation. No collection is complete, no narrative is exhaustive, yet we rarely communicate this to our visitors, or rarely do this successfully. I've been very frustrated that sadly people aren't drawn to museums for what they can't see. They are drawn for what they can see. At the University of Michigan Museum of Art, we have begun to engage absence directly, or trying to at least. In rethinking our African gallery, we adopted the title, "We Write to You About Africa," intentionally referencing the metaphor of the postcards. Postcards, we argue, are inherently subjective, often reductive, and they actually reveal more about the sender than they do about the subject. So too, we argue, do Western collections of African art. Rather than claiming to present a comprehensive or an authoritative history, the gallery foregrounds the fragmentary nature of our holdings. They are products of specific institutional, geopolitical, and colonial histories. And actually, each work is accompanied by a little world map that shows you how the work ended up in Ann Arbor. A companion space titled "I Write to You from Africa" invites African artists, scholars, and community members to respond to the collection through handwritten postcards, which we invite the artists to write in their own language and on their own terms. Sent to us, we then have it translated into English. And these responses are exhibited alongside curatorial texts to offer a multiplicity of perspectives and to disrupt curatorial authority. This approach reflects, of course, as we all know, a broader shift towards transparency and multivocality in museology. It challenges the singular institutional voice and invites critique from those who have been excluded from the production of knowledge within museum spaces. And as one small example that I wanted to share, this was one of our latest acquisitions for the African collection. This is a work by Ghanaian ceramicist Fred Okai. And as part of the acquisition itself, we worked with him, and he is a member of an artist collective called Black Star Lines. And we commissioned the collective to record the movement of the work from central Ghana to eventually Detroit and Ann Arbor. So we now have this wonderful, if it works, it might not work. Let's see. that's not going to work. But we have this wonderful video where you see the piece being loaded into like a truck bed, on top of a truck bed, and driven to Accra. And it's a very powerful way of getting our students to reflect on how these are works that are made in space and time by people, and that none of these works just appear in the Midwest without reason. The notion of absence has also informed our collaborations with contemporary artists. Fred Okai is one of them, but another pertinent example is Chinupa Hanska Luger's 2023 intervention on the facade of our historic Alumni Memorial Hall. Luger, who's also in Sean's show, he's an enrolled member of the 3 affiliated tribes of Fort Berthold, and he painted the word gift, G-I-F-T, across the museum's columns using white porcelain clay slip. And I have to tell you, that's the hardest thing I've ever had to do, was to convince the university to let us do this. Over several days, the clay expanded to cover the entire facade of the building, and over subsequent months, natural weathering returned it to the earth. This temporal embodied action directly referenced the land upon which the University of Michigan stands, land that was obtained via the 1817 Treaty of Fort Meigs, in which indigenous nations were said to have gifted territory for the establishment of educational institutions. Luger's work interrogates that myth of benevolence, exposing the violence and the disposition beneath it. In Chinupa's words, and I quote, "Whiteness is a concept, and though it has created many catastrophic systemic issues and problems, it is essentially a function of perception. Gift asks people to perceive whiteness differently. It is thin, it is temporary, and it is slipping away." Through all these examples, through jars sealed photographs, Luger's weathering clay, or even We Write to You About Africa, we are reminded that representation is powerful, but that it is also a choice, and very often an insufficient one. Jars' boxes are not empty. They are full, and full of what we cannot look at directly. The same is true for the museum. We must begin to curate not just what we have, but what we lack. To listen, as Tina Kant says, to the quiet. There is, I believe, a particular potency in this silence. A refusal to visualize can invite deeper contemplation, more profound engagement. Absence, far from being a void, may serve as an invitation, an insistence that we approach the unrepresentable with humility and care. Ultimately, what these works teach us is that memory does not reside in form alone. It resides in the ethical posture that we adopt towards history, in the accountability we demand of our institutions, and in the capacity we cultivate to sit with what cannot be resolved. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. So I think what we were going to do now is bring up a couple of chairs, and I invite Laura and Sascha with me to join in conversation with you all. Yeah, where it makes the most. Maybe we'll turn this off so we don't have the letter. Oh, we're gonna do both sides.
Yeah.
So we wanted to, of course, open the conversation to the audience, to all of you, to see what kind of thoughts or questions came to your mind. And I thought, well, maybe people are gathering your thoughts and questions and finishing writing your notes. I would just pose one sort of kind of expounding question to both of you. I was really kind of interested in how both artists, Alfredo Jar and Larissa Sansour, encountered this sort of frustration or, the kind of idea of failure of arts to adequately represent or convey the situation in Rwanda, in Palestine. And so the kind of question about expounding on that, I just was curious to know more sort of about, that how that came to be in the artist's lives, if you have any more information kind of what sort of process or journey, even, kind of like times or events in the artist's lives that this, I don't know if frustration is the word, maybe you have a different word for it, but refusal or kind of thoughts about the failure of art, especially this kind of documentary art.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that she's talked about it a ton, but so the later works, starting with In Vitro, I think, Sansour talks about those as, or they're presented as a collaboration between Sansour and Soren Lind, who is, her partner, but like in life too, and he is a science fiction writer. And so while she hasn't made those because like those explicit connections, my feeling is that, she had science fiction in her life in other ways and kind of ended up finding that to be, an outlet. In a way that we talked about a little bit, the fact that it allows for kind of some of these conversations in ways that are maybe coming at it sideways a little bit, and so make space for kind of talking about some of like the absurdity of these things by uprooting them from their kind of direct context. So I don't know that I have a ton of of her own reflections on that, but definitely this is something that was kind of like in her, in her life in general, and so seemed almost like a natural kind of space for this kind of collaboration.
Yeah, I think I'm sort of thinking through the arc of Jar's practice, and it appears to me, and I think he would agree, that it really was a turning point for him, the Rwanda project, and the fact that he spent so many years, over a decade, and honestly, I think it's still not complete. I think he would say that too. And over 20 projects, just trying to grapple with the same frustration, and I definitely know he would use that word frustration, of the how the images were just not effective anymore. And it's also been a thread that has continued throughout his career in very different storylines. Like a really powerful work that he made famously is about a South African photographer named Kevin Carter, who took a very famous image, and I don't know whether it was as famous here in the US as it was in Europe, but I would say like most people in Europe, when they think of the conflict in Sudan, would recall this image, and it's of a small child with a vulture close by. It's this really, really difficult image. The photographer, it's a very famous case study of the ethical responsibility of photojournalists, and he famously ended up taking his own life after making that photograph, and there's a lot of discussions about whether that was a direct result of that experience. But so that's another thread that Jar has made work on, is Kevin Carter and that image. And so I would say that he continues to think through the ethics of representation or inaction, both on the part of those making the photographs as those viewing.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, both that kind of, the ethics of representation, and then this ethics of viewing that he's really kind of making us think about. Mm-hmm. So we would like to get sort of also questions from you. I think we have another microphone that might be passing around, which is for the purposes of our recording. So if you would raise your hand and then just wait a second for the microphone to arrive. Yes, Anne.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a really powerful pair of papers, and Sean for really beautiful framing remarks. I was struck, Sean, by something you said in your opening comments that I think played out in really interesting ways in these two papers. And that is the issue of what cannot be said, or perhaps what cannot be shown. And I'm extremely interested in this problem of how a Palestinian documentarian turns to science fiction, in a sense, to create scenarios that rise above and beyond one specific political conflict to look at something more broader in the human experience, and yet which retains those ties, but this problem of how to acknowledge them. And the fact that I'm sure the artist is grappling with that. And I'm interested, Sascha, in how you may grapple with them as a historian, both in understanding the nature of a particular political problem, but also a problem that goes beyond the political boundaries of Israel and Palestine into what is considered articulable, demonstrable within the art world right now.
Yeah.
And then also, Laura, really interesting to think about what Alfredo Har was grappling with in terms of this problem of the saturation of images. And then this deliberate decision perhaps to make something more visible to us precisely by withdrawing it from view. So I love the way in which this challenge played out in each of your papers, and I just wondered if you might reflect a little further on its implications. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think about, especially as someone who is not Palestinian, right, and not from has no ethnic ties to the region, but who specializes in work from Southwest Asia, especially Palestine, is kind of making sure that, I see my role as an art historian. I'm not here to tell these stories. I'm here to talk about how these other people are telling their own stories. And so, I mean, you see, I try and quote from the artist. I mean, not to kind of make the artist, no offense, Joshua, precious, in any way, the supremacist kind of of their own narrative. But just this, especially when talking about their own experiences, that is really foregrounded and central. And also that, in terms of what can be said in various spaces, I think also as a scholar who, again, is not Palestinian, and especially as someone who is Jewish, especially given kind of the narratives of equivalencies of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and other kind of various ridiculous statements that are kind of being thrown around. I think I very much see kind of not trying to equivocate in that language and to be kind of very insistent. I mean, I just started at Drake this year. One of the first things I said was can I keep teaching my Palestinian art class? Am I teaching this class? When can I teach this class? And I'm teaching it right now. And so I think kind of this, I sort of, I wait around for someone else to push back against me. I'm not, going to kind of self-censor in advance or kind of say, oh, what can I say and what can I not say? But I sort of see that as, in this conversation that we were in yesterday, we're talking about kind of the actual physical of putting your body in between kind of these attacks on students with deportations and things like that. And I think in a much lower stakes, but academic sense of kind of putting my academic body in the way of kind of as sort of a responsibility that I see in my work as someone who is not as at risk. I mean, I know colleagues who do have ethnic, ties to either Palestine or the region who have a harder time with these things. And I know that as a white woman, I'm allowed in spaces to talk about things. And so I take that as a responsibility, I think, as well.
I would say with, and it's interesting you just said, I'm allowed, and I think about that a lot in regards to real pictures, because I love, one of my favorite things about it is that it's in these boxes that clearly are meant to be opened. Many people who have done research in archives also know these boxes. They're a very specific type. And it's that like that interruption of something that you feel like you're allowed to do and you're privileged to see. And I find that in the context of an academic art museum really compelling, because I think the kind of white academic gaze is very much about like everything is up for grabs under the number of research. And I think what makes the Rwanda project so powerful is that Jared was sort of saying that it happened is not, that's not what I'm trying to prove here with these images. It played out in the very eye of the public eye of the world. We are accepting that. And that also, by the way, is not the case for all genocides. So let's say that is one with Rwanda and there are many other contested things about the Rwandan genocide. Let me also put in that caveat. But what he could do is think, well, considering that these images were for all to see and they didn't have the impact that was needed, what else can we do with them to get people to stop in their tracks and think further about their own complicit nature?
Just to kind of jump on that, as you were talking, I was thinking about a different artist who's actually based in Chicago now, but from Dearborn, Noor Balut. Do you know Noor's work at all?
No,
but so Noor is from Lebanon originally, but grew up in Dearborn, and so is Lebanese American and identifies as Muslim and trans, and has done a lot of work about kind of like queer and transless in Muslim community. And so it all often deals with things of like an archive of denial, but you don't have the privilege to have access to this in some way.
Oh, yeah.
There's a project that I know we're working on where they had found kind of like old diaries of an aunt who took her own life that they are often compared to within their family, and that there are suspicions that this aunt was queer. And so finding this diary and kind of reprinting it, but on transparent materials so you can't actually read it, especially when it's all stacked on top of each other because it's etched into it. And so this presence of an archive that you are also denied full access to in a way that you, feel privileged that you should have access to it. And that the power of that refusal. Yeah.
I couldn't, I don't think I found it online, but I was wondering whether Bowdoin has, in its database, its online database, whether you show the image. Do you know? Because some museums do and some don't.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah.
And the ethics around that, I think, are complicated.
Yeah.
I would have to go back to see what exactly, because we have multiple. Oh, and we'll check. I was going to say that at least and the reason I'm not remembering this is because I think there was some switching around because we had new photography made. But I know that for when I started researching this project, it was an image online of the box open where you see the photograph. And so that was the view that if you had come to our website, you would have seen it open. And I think that had led to my being tripped up that it's actually supposed to be closed. And so, I'm not sure if we fixed it or not. Oh, oops.
No, it's
Oh, Frank.
So thank you so much again for being here. My interest is in artistic and cultural institutions in Palestine or in Rwanda, Congo, and what kind of programs, interventions have happened in those places, and in the course of, thinking about, our responsibilities as museums in the West in showing this, to what degree, we are in conversation with those organizations, and are there things that might be learned? Are there best practices for showing this work? So that it doesn't exist wholly, in the United States or in Europe, but that it's part of a sort of international sort of network and conversation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I also think that the answer to that is an ever-moving target as well, because it depends on, right after 94, there was a real need to prove that it had happened, which was a lot more important within the country than outside of the country, because there was a lot more genocide denial within the country. And Rwanda is well known, for example, for being one of the few countries alongside Cambodia to display human remains of the victims in their memorials and monuments. And that is, well, actually, one more is Ethiopia, I think, with the Derg Museum. But that is, I think, the prime example of how much it was felt that proof needed to be shown at first. That has since changed, and there have been actually burials of some of the human remains since, but there's still a lot of emphasis in country on commemorating the individuals that have died, because that I would say is the other thread. It's a lot more about 800,000 people. How do we wrap our minds around that? How do we tell the stories of those whose lives were lost? And I think the external reflections have been way more about the lack of intervention and the lack of reaction. So I do think that is appropriate as well. But when I did my doctoral research, which was so 10 years ago, I also learned that, and we know this from the Holocaust as well, that it takes decades for artistic responses to emerge in country by people who have lived through the experiences themselves, because it just takes removal and time to work through that. And I think we're seeing that more occur more and more. And the other thing that I should have mentioned is that this is not a conflict that ended in 94. And in fact, the images, for example, of the refugee camp that is on display in the exhibition are the same locations we're seeing in the newspaper today with the conflict in Eastern Congo and Kivu. So it's complicated, a short answer. But yes, there's a lot of, there are more and more artists within country too that are starting to reflect on the events.
I'll start where Laura ended. It's complicated. So I guess there's kind of like two, maybe three things that I'll highlight. One is that in terms of like Palestinian institutions, you don't have them in the territories until the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, because that's only when you get civil services being run by any sort of centralized Palestinian organization. So after the Oslo Accords, after 93, all the galleries and museums that exist in the West Bank, and I'll stay there just for the moment, all show up in the 90s and early 2000s to the mid. I mean, the Palestine Museum opens in 2016, I think. So there just aren't those kind of institutional organizations in existence within the Palestinian territories prior to that point. Part of it depends on the work, right? If it's so many contemporary Palestinian artists who live in country have worked in digital media because it can move across boundaries and borders very easily. Whereas a painting or a sculpture, you have to deal with trying to get it out of the territories, and there's just logistics of that make it unlikely, if not impossible, a lot of the time. There have been some kind of attempts at collaborations. There was this project by an artist named Khaled Hourani that's been known as like the Picasso in Palestine project, where the Van Abbas Museum worked with the International Academy of Art Palestine, which now no longer exists. It's been absorbed by Birzeit University, to get a Picasso to be displayed in Ramallah. It has a lot of problems with that project, but part of that whole project was about showing the difficulties of these kinds of things. But again, the fact that that was about bringing like this European and like a Picasso, because it's so well known, into the Palestinian space, as opposed to say a like Palestinian artist's work that exists outside, in is one of the many again things that could be critiqued about it, end up being kind of a political stunt as well, because the Haranis are very tied in with the Palestinian Authority there. But so there's kind of logistical challenges to that, and then also about what is this about exchange when there's not an even kind of like resource and playing ground from the beginning. The kind of second thing is about institutions within historic Palestine, but in the contemporary state of Israel. And there have been some instances of kind of Israeli institutions borrowing works by Palestinian artists, by collectors who live outside of the region, where the Palestinian artists do not want their works shown because it violates the academic and cultural boycott, but they don't own the works anymore, the collector does. So what are the ethics of this, right? So those are ethical conversations that are happening, and I think, again, there are instances of exhibitions that, for example, have been canceled, that kind of notoriously in Pittsburgh. I have 2 examples from 2014 that I've given talks about before. But basically, one of them was supposed to be at the Mattress Factory, and it was supposed to include 3 artists, 3 American artists, 3 Israeli artists, and 3 Palestinian artists. The curator, who thought this was kind of a great idea, but isn't a specialist in the region, first of all, had a hard time getting 3 Palestinian artists to agree to do this. But when they did, it was kind of on the kind of predication that all artists kind of acknowledged the power imbalance and all of these things. The Israeli artists were very on board with that. They also had to review all of the material before it got published. It was going okay until the day before it was set to open, and a press release got published without anyone reading it, and talked about how the artists had been collaborating in the art history context. Talking about collaboration, totally fine. Palestinian context, a collaborator is someone who works with the Israeli government. Collaborators are killed. And their families disgraced for generations. You cannot use that word in a Palestinian context. But no one who looked at it, because it wasn't shown to the artist, had that context. So the Palestinian artists said, we have to pull out. This is gonna get us in, threaten our lives, not only our careers, but this is a clear violation of the boycott. They threatened to pull out. Then the Israelis said, well, what if we pull out so you can be in the show? The Zionist media got, kind of a hold of it. The Zionist organization was like, see, you can't even have this kind of equivalency conversation. They won't allow them to be together. So the exhibition got canceled because then it was just going to be 3 American artists. And that was not much of a conversation. So and that's a U.S. institution. So you're having these sort of ethical conversations about boycott, about kind of who owns the work, but what are the, this idea I think extends way beyond this, but of what are the ethics of a collector loaning a work to an institution that holds politics or exists in a political context that the artists themselves would object to. Sure. What do you do with that? The last bit, I'm talking way too long, but the last little bit that I'll say is kind of on this idea of artists needing this distance from genocide to be able to reflect on it has been really, interesting is not the right word, but has been something I've been thinking about a lot as we've looked at the current genocide going on in Gaza, because as kind of the murder of so many people is being documented, the artists who are being killed is also being something being highlighted in, especially kind of arts media, Hyperallergic is often highlighting this and things like that. And so it's interesting to see how there are artists whose work is kind of broadly about peace, but it's doing this, or artists who are actually making either photojournalistic work or that is attempting to document, but then are being killed in this process as well. And so this kind of impossibility of separation of these things is also kind of, been interesting to see and grapple with, as well as having artists who are not living in country. There's an artist, Wafa Hourani, based in Ramallah, whose project, he had a project that was before called The Image of Everything, that the imagery has really shifted to include imagery of the kind of ongoing bombing campaign in Gaza, so that's actively using that imagery as it's happening. And so how is this gonna evolve, and what's gonna happen with this over the next however long remains to be seen, but yeah.
Thank you. Really.
Casey.
Anyone else wanna ask?
You go. Are you sure? Well, actually, no. I'm going to ask because it actually, I was like, wait a minute. No, because, yeah. You'll have your chance. No, and I don't think part of the reason that I wanted to jump in was, Sascha, you started addressing one of my big questions that emerged from both of your talks. Laura, I think you said something really beautiful, talking about sort of the speed in which the Rwandan genocide unfolded versus the sort of slowness of JAR's response to it. And one of the things, thinking about both of your presentations and your work in the context of Sean's exhibition, is that there's this tension between a need for immediacy and the need for, I think, slowness and the opportunity for responses and reflections to kind of unfold. And I think you really started hitting on it, but I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you see, in the context of Irreplaceable You, the relationship between the work that you do and sort of the social media, the fact that, right now we have situations that are unfolding in Gaza and, the entire Swana region that feel very immediate, but also have this deep historical timeline. And then I think likewise, not only Rwanda, but I'm also just thinking about institutional responsibilities towards their historical collections. So.
Right. Yeah, I think my immediate response to that would be, I don't know if this has been officially coined, but do people here talk about slow museology as well, right? Sort of taken from slow archaeology. And I think we're all feeling it in our fields and our daily work, that we have very much moved away from, here's a curator in their office, you're given 4 months to put together a show, to the current exhibition project that I'm working on, which, by the way, fully dependent on an NEH grant, so we'll see where that lands, but has 8 co-curators and 16 consultants. And if everything happens the way that I want it to happen, the show will open in 2027, and that will have been 10 years of working on this project. And I think that is where we're moving, because that is what we need. That is what we need to do, and it's the only way that kind of slowness is the only way to do this work well and thoughtfully and ethically. But it is completely counter to a lot of the processes set in place in our institutions, or by funders, by sponsors, so it's very difficult to continue to convince, especially granting bodies, that this is deeply needed in our field, instead of a luxury that is sometimes afforded for particularly complex projects. So that's sort of what I'm thinking on, is that, and what I always also liked about JAR is that it's sort of unresolved. It's attempt after attempt after attempt, and it will never be successful at the end. And I think that's also a powerful and maybe freeing way of doing our work, because I did as Sean mentioned, I did a project on restitution of our African collection, and we did not repatriate a single work, but we tried really hard for 2 years, and we shared all of the steps that we undertook during that time. And I think that there was still something very powerful in that attempt too.
I just wanted to kind of come in for a second to say that what you were talking about made me think of conversations that we had a few years ago about about feeling that urgency, feeling that need for museums to have a sort of rapid response. And I mean, I think that was what museums were kind of broadly feeling, that it's like, oh, we have to sort of respond to the times, and the times were changing so quickly. And so, I don't know, that almost sounds like maybe, sort of museums thinking about sort of coming back to the strengths of museums, which is this sort of like longue durée.
Longue durée, yes. The exception being, by the way, when museums are very responsive is when they cancel shows.
Yeah.
They do that from one day to the next.
So in this Palestinian art class that I teach in the last day of course content, which we just did this last week, I, instead of me bringing anything in, I asked students to go find work of any form. It can be music, it can be, a poster, it could be visual art, whatever, that's responding to the events post October 7th, 2023. And the vast majority of them, even by well-established artists like Slimane Mansour, who's been making work for forever. I don't know how this man is still as prolific as he is, because he's definitely in his 80s, but were found on social media, right? And so the accessibility of that and the ability of rapid response, it serves its purpose. But I think then kind of the museum context, because that's serving that purpose, to find another place to be. And one of the things that I'm thinking about with Sansour's work is that, so Nation Estate is the second of which is kind of referred to as her sci-fi trilogy. It's 9 minutes long. The one that precedes it, Space Exodus, is I think 5 minutes long. And then the one after it, In the Future They Ate from the Finest Porcelain, is about 28 minutes long. In Vitro, also about kind of 30 minutes long. And now she's working on a feature-length film. She has some short films, but part of this, of course, is her budget has gotten bigger, right? Okay. So she can. But I think also there's about slowing this down and being able to explore things over a longer duration. In Vitro was the first work that removed color. Since then, I don't know that she's done a work that's in color. It's been black and white. So I think there's also something about this pull in both directions of going into the future and also going into the past. A recent work of hers I saw in Boston earlier this year also involved doing an entire operatic aria in Arabic in this woman the garments that the woman is in are rooted in Palestinian tatris, traditional embroidery, but have this kind of futuristic spin on them. And she's sort of moving through this architectural space that's quite ancient, but then also in these kind of ethereal, cloud-like, space-like spaces as well. And so this pull kind of further in both directions of time, I think is also really interesting. There's one of the things that I've been talking about in my science fiction class this whole semester is how science fiction collapses time. So past, present, and future are all kind of on top of each other. And I think that that's also, in a way to kind of bring this kind of longue durée, if you insist, into a singular moment or a singular kind of work in that way as well.
Cyantin, we would love to hear your question.
I couldn't possibly after Casey wrapped it up so beautifully, but I will. But I will. I worry that it might open up the floodgates again, but I was struck by a resonance in both of your presentations about the kind of limits of the quotidian image. And so, Laura, in your discussion of Jar, even though there's such a glut of imagery, it's not enough, right? So we have to put it away, and then we have to put it away for it to mean something. And then for Sansour, we have to go above and beyond our lived reality. We have to go to some kind of place of excess. And I was wondering whether you could talk about that, the kind of, because I like to think there's a power in everyday imagery, but obviously there are, despite it, there are places it can't go or places it can't reach. So I was wondering whether you could just reflect on that.
Yeah. I mean, so this idea of compassion fatigue is something that is something that I've been thinking about since grad school. But it's a term that comes from psychology and is used to talk about EMTs and medical workers and how basically this saturation of the awful you become desensitized to it, and that one of the reasons why people in those contexts tend to have a really dark humor is that humor is a great way to break apart compassion fatigue and kind of bypass it. And so, I think part of it is this acknowledgement of compassion fatigue. And also, at least in the Palestinian context, it's it's a compassion fatigue, but also just kind of like a stereotype that goes along with it, right? So like the image of the like kufiya-clad Palestinian fighter, resistance fighter as terrorist, right? And so these quotidian images, like there's a saturation of them, and that saturation has also been manipulated in a particular way, especially in kind of like a Euro-American news media context. And so one way is kind of like this lean into either humor, so like the films of Elia Suleiman, which are like very like Monty Python level absurdist, as a way of kind of talking about these quotidian realities and how like they actually are this absurd, but also like humor as a way to kind of get around some of that. And then there's kind of the fantastical, the exaggeration. Other artists, one of the other things I'm really interested in to talk about time, which I'm also like very, very interested in, is, and Sansour has talked about this too, about that Palestinian time is very cyclical and repetitive. And so rather than kind of utilizing necessarily like these quotidian images, this kind of like focus on articulating that repetitious cycle, inserting kind of like historical images, and she does some of this in some of the other works, into like a contemporary or even futuristic context, like referencing this kind of repetition, gets at sort of the ideas or like the feelings around this, of these experiences. So these quotidian like experiences, not through documentation of the experience, but through creation of the affect around experiencing that.
Mm. Yeah, I also, I'll just add, I know you asked about Jar, but I'm also thinking about Chinupa's work actually, because part of like what I realized, again, revisiting the work that I'd done on the commemorations in Rwanda, is that it really struck me so much because it really reminded me of this work that had been done in Berlin as a commemoration to the Holocaust, where they built the first vanishing monument, which was actually a 40-feet tower that was lowered into the ground over the course of multiple years, as people added their names to the pillar. It's Jochen Goetz's vanishing monument. And I thought that's the same thing with Chinupa and with Jar, is that interruption of your expectations, right? It's the out of the ordinary. The thing that I didn't really mention with Chinupa's project is that our museum is actually a memorial itself. It's called Alumni Memorial Hall. It's a memorial to multiple civil wars and the victims of them. Not civil wars, multiple wars that the US was involved in, one civil war. But anyway,
I thought you were being prescient, right?
God. But it's the same with memorialization, that if there's monuments all around you, there are so few people that know that, right? Because they become your daily experience. So how do you, sorry to always return to the same guy, but like, how do you create that punctum, right? Like, how do you make people stop and think? And that was very much like, okay, let's cover it in ceramic slip and see. So I think it's the same. It's just like, it's an ever-moving target in that way that we will get used to. We maybe have gotten used to artists entombing their photographs in boxes at some point. And then it will be the next thing that we will have to try to get that response from people.
Well, the next part of this afternoon's festivities is a coffee break. So we would like to invite people that we have some coffee and refreshments. And if you have more questions for Laura and Sascha, feel free to descend on them over coffee.
Or wait until the conversation.
True, yes. And I just really want to extend another very hearty thank you to both of you for those talks, and also your generosity here with sharing your expertise with all of us. So thank you so much.